Hello there, and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. In this edition, I'm joined by Luke Walker. How are you today?
I'm quite good, thanks. How are you?
I'm alright. I must apologise for any listener from last week's edition. I did sound quite depressed and rotten last week. The fact is I had a very brief illness which lasted for about 4 hours. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and it certainly wasn't the coronavirus. In terms of the news, it's been a bit of a slow week, but there have at least been more uplifting stories coming through. We've had the Prime Minister's new baby, Wilfred Laurie Nicholas Johnson, and the name Nicholas is dedicated to two doctors who share the name who treated Boris when he was ill in hospital. I also won £20 on a scratch card, which is the highest win I've had in about 2 years.
Congratulations.
There's been more good news with Captain Tom Moore, the Army veteran who raised £30 million for the NHS frontline by walking laps of his garden. He's turned 100 this week and received over 125,000 birthday cards. Captain Moore has since been made an honorary colonel. Now, I suppose I've been slightly inspired by him, and I've started a fundraiser where I'm walking every day in May in support of our local food bank. Do you think that many other people will be inspired to follow in his footsteps?
I would hope so. It wouldn't start like a mass movement or something, but I could see a good amount of people inspired by the guy and doing their own bit for charity and to help the NHS against the COVID-19.
Do you think that the spirit of generosity is going to last beyond the crises that are currently going on, if you consider the impending economic disaster that people may be losing their jobs, businesses failing, household finances tightening?
As a pessimist, I would say no. In the short term, I would say the shared consciousness of the feelings to fight the disease will probably continue. But then if the IMF report is deemed to be correct, we would see a large amount of people probably getting angry, worried, scared, and begin to turn on one another or trying to blame other people. And then support for one another will probably end quite quickly.
What worries you most about the IMF report?
I think it was mainly when it was saying we're going to have a second Great Depression. As a political student and a history student, we already seen the rise of political extremism from the Second World War caused by the First Great Depression. And then since the 2008 recession, we had the rise of populism. In Greece, we had like a communist party basically take over the government. And was it Golden Dawn? A neo-Nazi party come quite high in the rankings of political parties there as well. It becomes the same situations for more richer countries like Germany, France, Britain, America. It would be more worrying. And at the same time, if this report is correct and we're reeling from the economic devastation caused from the lockdown, major economies like China will only just take advantage. The morality complex for the Communist Party is quite disturbing. For example, recently during the COVID-19 outbreak, they've used it as camouflage to arrest democratic leaders in Hong Kong, doing military exercises next to Taiwan to scare them, after their president has made repeated calls to declare independence and make in Taiwan its own people. But I think the IMF report was more just like a remembrance of the past and how the ills of human traits will probably come out the most compared to the good.
Do you think that people are placing the social costs as a higher value than the economic costs?
I would say so, yes, because people are quite emotional, aren't they? They're not fixated on numbers or the stock market or the economics of a state, because rarely most people really understand it. And then when it comes to losing a loved one, it's more powerful than it is losing a big chunk of your bank. But at the same time, we need to remember that if the economic aspect gets greater than what the pandemic caused, the long-term effects from that could be even greater in its devastation.
How long do you think it's going to take for us to get back to normality?
The European Union started to open up slowly. China's begun to do it. Sweden never went into lockdown, but with the UK, I feel like they're a bit nervous. The testing has been quite slow. The death numbers keep rising. Hopefully they'll start open up, I'd reckon, by mid-June. Slowly start opening things back up. Probably be a long time. It seems like the British government's very cautious, especially as the Prime Minister got it as well. Like he himself is probably like, this disease is deadly, it's horrible. And then it's reaffirmed his belief to try and be more focused on the pandemic than the economics.
Do you think that the mindset is also a factor here? Because a lot of people are having it impressed upon them that we can't go outside, we have to keep social distancing. Do you not think that that will last a lot longer?
Yeah, I could see that being imprinted in our minds. More so with the elderly and the older people. With the young, I'd say they'll probably just get back to normal, especially like in student bars or normal pubs. People just be like getting back to the same way they used to be. But a lot of, I'd say, elderly or middle-aged people will probably have the social distancing still in their mind, distancing from one another in case the virus is there. I could also see when the lockdown is lifted, not a lot of people would go out to like restaurants, corner shops, or pubs or cinemas or concerts, which will stagnate the growth of the local economy while it desperately needs investment.
The NHS has been a great focus of this entire pandemic. There's been a bit of an NHS Nightingale nightmare, and I've got a quote from The Guardian here. The showpiece Nightingale Hospital in London will shut next week after treating a small number of patients, but will be kept in hibernation in case a second wave of COVID-19 infections emerges. The Nightingale, built in the Excel Conference Centre in the Docklands area of London, has proved surplus to requirements in the fight against coronavirus because established hospitals in the capital cope much better with the influx of critically ill patients after hugely expanding their intensive care units. It's going to close on the 15th of May. Originally planned to have 4,000 beds, the Nightingale has treated just 54 patients since it was opened by Prince Charles on the 3rd of April and received its first patient on the 7th. It has not admitted a new patient for a week. The 4 other Nightingales that were open to stop hospitals being overwhelmed in Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol and Harrogate will also be wound down. Do you not think that this is a massive waste of resources, because all of the things that have gone into these Nightingale hospitals could have actually been used on the front line elsewhere in the existing NHS?
Yeah, maybe. I think a lot of the problematic situations the NHS has had to suffer during the pandemic has mainly come down to being basically underfunded from the austerity measures caused by the Conservative government after a decade of being cut and staff fired. And then we had the doctors and nurses strikes a couple of years ago. And then when Matt Hancock had to ask for 250,000 volunteers out in the NHS, when I was watching that, I was just sitting there just going, like, why did you cut the funding? Why did you fire the doctors and nurses when situations like this could happen? And at the same time, I think they had a emergency like treasure chest of funds to deal with an epidemic like this. The Conservative Party got rid of it or defunded it because they saw the case of an outbreak being very small. So I think a lot of the situations we have today comes from the Conservatives being underprepared and not funding the necessary institutions to try and tackle a crisis like this. Even before this situation, we had the NHS already in crisis with the bed numbers for waiting patients going up. The situation wasn't bliss before the pandemic. It's just re-highlighted as a serious issue that we already had. And then things like the Nightingale hospitals just shows a panic, I'd say, of trying to deal with the virus, but not thinking it through thoroughly.
There was 10 Nightingale hospitals that were planned originally. Do you think that the government, taken as a whole, has significantly overestimated the scale of the pandemic?
I wouldn't say they've overestimated. I think they literally saw the problem and then realised they just didn't have the tools to deal with it effectively. And so they had to resort to a lockdown. When it got to the point of abandoning herd immunity, they were just like, oh, we're just going to have to shut it down. Hopefully we can keep everyone indoors. The demand for the NHS will be decreased so the resources aren't as strained as they already were. It wasn't overestimate the virus, but more just understood the danger it had. But they knew the institutions to deal with it was not in the right place.
Because even the basics, such as washing your hands regularly and catching your coughs and sneezes, that message has actually been lost in the broader narrative of protecting the NHS and saving lives.
It's quite amazing as well that people weren't doing that in the first place.
Yes. The Worldometer's website demonstrates that Britain's daily new case numbers have plateaued but don't seem to be declining, despite the fact that the Prime Minister said that we've passed the peak. The daily death rate is fortunately declining, but there's major concerns over the inclusion of care homes in the official statistics, and that the numbers may actually be worse. There are fears as well that people with other potentially life-threatening conditions are also avoiding hospitals. I've got a quote from The Sun here. England's excess death rate is one of the worst in Europe amid the coronavirus panic. Figures from Euromomo reveal that England has had the highest level of excess deaths for the past 4 weeks. Why do you think that the UK is being so badly affected by this pandemic?
I think it's like what I said before. It came down to the austerity measures defunding the NHS to a certain extent, that it was already put in a crisis position before it. And thus, when the virus came in, it did not have the necessary resources to deal with the virus correctly and in a measured manner, and has just ended up panicking and setting up these NHS Nightingale hospitals to try and deal with the coping mechanisms against it.
Do you not think it's perhaps due to disorganisation or mismanagement within the NHS in terms of how it's structured?
Maybe. The NHS probably does need a review of its management. Like Tony Blair's government tried to do it with them boards. We should constantly strive to experiment with the NHS to modernise it and to keep it up to date with current affairs of technology and new practices in economics to the best performance ability that it can achieve.
Do you think that the NHS in recent years has gone beyond its remit? Because after all, it was only there to provide a basic form of healthcare.
I don't know. Like, if we adopt the insurance system as the Americans, I would very not prefer that. With the inability for some families to pay for like cancer treatments, and in order to pay for them, they go into bankruptcy. I would very much prefer having a free NHS and not worrying with the healthcare costs.
Do you think that the choice ought to be there, though, so that it's the NHS and insurance-based systems?
Yeah, definitely. I would not want to restrict the choices or the individual's freedom and to choose what they wish. If they want to go in an insurance company, then that's their prerogative. Like, they should be able to do that.
Moving on to the lockdown being lifted, it's been lifted now in some European countries. Do you think that the socioeconomic pain is going to endure for a longer time in this country, considering the point at which we're at?
100%, I'd say. Because we still have to deal with Brexit and the trouble of how people might panic, say investors or businesses. Because it took so long to bring about a Brexit agreement to begin the withdrawal process. Businesses and individuals normally panic when in the market. So when it comes to the coronavirus, for the shutdown continuing for so long, people will start to panic whilst the other economy starts to lift and try and start getting things going. And investors in the UK will see the lockdown continuing whilst the government is still having to try and come up with a final agreement with the EU. The uncertainty would become probably too great to deal with.
I'm surprised by the number of people who are backing draconian measures such as the lockdown, even when most of the information and several experts, Professor Witkowski and Professor Carl Hennigan, I've mentioned both of them before, they are stating that this has been the wrong response to the pandemic.
I would say no, because it's a repetitive narrative message that's constantly played in the radios, the TVs, celebrities say it, the government officials say it. So when other academics say the opposite, they'll just be not as highlighted as what the government message is. It's not surprising because it's kind of generally what the average person would only hear. When it comes to like other academics, you would have to search for that, and majority of people won't do that.
Do you think that's quite dangerous? Because obviously that's narrowing down debates and narrowing down scrutiny of the government's policies.
Yes, it is quite worrying an extent that a repetitive narrative is made by the government, but probably in their point of view, they're most likely going to treat it like a war. So the sense of having a debate or trying to create multiple camps against the measure might distract them from achieving what they want to. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I would not want to see it continued after the lockdown.
One thing that they have been developing, the government in partnership with the NHS, is a new coronavirus tracking app, which is going to be trialled on the Isle of Wight to suppress the hypothetical second wave of the virus. How effective do you think this app will be, considering that the worst of the crisis would surely have passed by the time it comes into full operation?
Like, how would it work?
One of the features of it is that it's going to have automated tracking. So I imagine it's going to use GPS data from the phone.
I don't know. It's a strange one, isn't it? Because you have the principle of the government being able to track your whereabouts. At the same time, that it's categorizing groups into two camps. You have the virus or you don't have the virus. And at the same time, as you said, the coding might take such a long time to do that it might come out when the virus has already passed. Or many elderly people not having a great understanding of technology might not be able to use it. And some people outright might just be like, I do not want to put my details in this app. I do not want people knowing I had the virus. Or they might refrain from coming near me ever again. Or might be used against me in some way.
Because that is quite dangerous, isn't it? Depending on what information that they're going to get from this technology. The government could know all sorts of things about you. Is that a major privacy concern?
Yeah, it's at the recent Supers Charter that was passed by Theresa May's government. Sometimes it is a bit worrying of how much the government's reach in our technology devices are, because they most likely will gather data, but for the average person, they will most likely never use it against them. I've seen how we don't live in like Russia or China. I think it probably very much depends on the government and then the use and then what data they are categorizing. Say like when Edward Snowden released the documents for the British and the American Secret Service, I didn't see like a mass panic. But if the FSB had the capability to spy on everyone in the Western world in the same scale as the Western Secret Services had, I think people would be terrified. Just because of the government differences, them being quite autocratic compared to us being more democratic. It's like the same system as well with China in their social credit system, where they can track whereabouts and then they social score you on your activities and then prohibit you from doing certain things if it goes against the state. Very Orwellian.
Well, that brings me on to comments being made by an EU official. Very relevant to Orwell. There's a quote from The Independent here. UK shops would have suffered food shortages during the pandemic without the single market. In explosive comments, Margaritis Sheenus said Britain was fortunate it had not crashed out of the block when the coronavirus struck, even as Boris Johnson vows to do just that in December if necessary. It was only the close economic ties of the single market that kept our supermarkets stocked during these difficult times, the Vice President of the European Commission argued. He said, I think it's quite fortunate that the United Kingdom goes through the pandemic with the certainty of being part of the single market. Now, the essential problem in that is that the supplies did run short, not just here in Britain, but all over Europe. Some stores are still struggling to meet the demands. And surely the single market has proven itself a failure during this pandemic because it hasn't been able to combat the economic shocks, not just the additional demands, but in terms of the commodity prices, currencies, stock markets. What are your thoughts on this?
I wouldn't say it was a failure of the single market, seeing how it's able to compete with the Chinese and the American economies. I'd say I disagree with her, but only in the case that Britain was not on the pathway of crashing out of the EU. It may have been like that a couple of months ago, but when the Brexit agreement was made, it was pretty much guaranteed there would be a successor agreement, which then would guarantee trade links between the two entities. Where especially with Boris getting such a big majority, that was pretty much guaranteed. But if we did crash out, say if we had May's government and we did crash out in a no-deal Brexit, I think we would have been in a severe situation. And it would probably be more beneficial to be in the single market during the pandemic. I wouldn't say it's shown a weakness, but I'd say more down to the shortages is because no one is working. And like farmers, as we've seen, there's various videos on the internet showing farmers dropping milk down the drain. The lack of workers being able to pick fruit or get food for us has lessened the ability for them to supply supermarket chains across Europe and the UK. The sources mainly come down really to the lockdown itself, because it's put so many people indoors. It's unable to supply supermarkets because the workers aren't there, essentially. because other people are making arguments that capitalism was unable to cope with the situation, which was kind of just taking advantage of it, compared to the communists, like say Marxism, Leninism system wasn't able to fill their supermarkets during even normal times. So I think capitalism and the single market have done quite well to the best of their abilities, while a lot of workers are remaining in home.
So we probably disagree on a fair amount politically, but this is a very intriguing situation because you messaged me privately regarding the comments I've made on social media against the lockdown, and you agreed with me. Obviously, we both believe in a different outcome to the one that we've got to put up with, but what's been the process that has led you to the conclusion that the lockdown is wrong?
Mainly it comes down to like economics. With the IMF report coming out that we're going to face a second Great Depression, it came to the point that it was like, is it worth tackling the virus, but at the same time making an economic situation that will cause far more hurt, more destruction, and rise into scenarios of like political extremism? Situations like that would be far more damaging to all of us as a society than the virus. The virus is deadly, but at the same time it's short term, where an economic factor would be long term, and then you would lead into like triple effects such as like suicide rates going up. We have more issues, and we can't just focus on the virus. And at the same time, the lockdown, although it's incredibly deadly, we do need to lift it in a certain way to let the economy breathe, to re-strengthen the West in order to tackle other situations such as like political extremism if it just go up from the economic downsides and the rise of China.
Do you think that the lockdown was simply the wrong policy?
It made a lot of sense to like let the NHS breathe after like a decade of being cut by the Conservative Party. And they didn't have enough ventilators. They obviously don't have enough testing equipment. I think essentially it was a good thing to begin the lockdown, but they should have done it quicker. And they should have bought testing equipment faster. Like, I think they had contracts, or they were being offered contracts, which they were just denying. So a lot of incompetence was being shown in the government, which then made the lockdown a bad thing, essentially. The lifespan of how long it's gone on for and the economic damage it's done, I think in the long term it might be considered the wrong thing to do. I was reading a journal article, I can't remember who wrote it now. They were saying how like a lockdown as well is quite an old technique to try and tackle viruses. And it sometimes can be more crippling and damaging than it actually tries to benefit the society or the people.
Do you think that you're not alone in terms of being reluctant to speak out publicly against the lockdown?
Publicising your views against the lockdown, I think the criticism would be quite heavy, wouldn't it? If you spoke out against it publicly, like when you were publicly doing it on Facebook, I wouldn't do that. I'd be too intimidated, I'd say, because of the response you could get from it. It's the lockdown is very much supported, and many people don't really care about economics or how bad this situation for the financial system becomes. The media in the UK is very much focused on the coronavirus and constantly reporting death rates and never really talking about the recovery rates. The people are kind of being put into like a frenzy. They've all been then united by the government's call, by the lockdown, to then say like, don't go outside, don't interact with people because we have to protect the NHS. If you speak against that, it can come back at you in a negative way.
What does this bode for the future? Because surely if such a trend continues, we're going to become more introverted, more introspective, more socially inhibited.
Yeah, it's a lot of social media, isn't it? It's like everyone becomes linked to like one narrative. It's the trend's been going on for quite a while. And if you speak against the trend or the narrative, it can come back at you quite severely. And as a society, it's less debative and like talkative, kind of narrower in its political views.
Has that contributed to the rise of echo chambers and people thinking that they're right all the time when clearly they're not?
Yeah, there's self-determination to their own views. People have become very like self-convicted that their views are right and less willing to debate or discuss the ideas of an alternative. Like in the Labour Party, the support for Corbyn was like solid. And if you were a Blairite, you were like, no, you have to leave the party.
Obviously, like, we knew each other at university, and I think The first occasion at which we met was a Labour Party social, which I attended because I studied history and politics and I wanted to explore a range of views and just meet interesting people. And I went in there thinking it would be quite left-wing, but I was actually astounded at the number of Blairites in society at that time. Now, obviously, you've changed your political home since then. So tell us about the journey from going from Labour to where you are now.
So I was originally in the Labour Party from 2015 to 2018. And I was more on the right-wing side of that party, so a Blairite. And when Corbyn took over, I was like, okay, I'll stick with it. By 2017, I was a bit like okay with the manifesto and a bit all right with it. And it comes 2018, the NAC, the National Executive Committee, becomes taken over by Corbynistas. And the politics get more wackier. And it gets to like 2019, with the manifesto they made. But in 2018, I was like, I have to leave. I can't do this anymore. I just don't believe in it. And I was flirting with the Liberals since 2017. So I was like, I'm just going to go join them. Because I do describe myself more as like a social liberal radical centrist. So I thought to myself that I was more at home with the Liberal Democrats than with Labour. And then at the same time, I was like, the Labour Party is not going to get into power at the state it's in. So I'd rather just join a small minority party that actually is more in line with my beliefs, even if they don't get into government. Labour won't either, so I'll just stick with the minority party.
Do you think that Labour will ever make it back into power if it continues on the way that it's going?
Well, Keir Starmer did quite well when he was elected leader. Like, the moderates took over the NEC, the leadership, the deputy leadership, and they got a lot of trade union support, except for like Len McCluskey, who's just a left-wing nutter. But I think it's a long way to go. They still need to convince a large proportion of the membership of their views, and then trying to get the public's trust again, and trying to fix the anti-Semitic issue, and the amount of incompetence from that party throughout the opposition years. And then Corbyn damaged their relationship with the media. So it's going to take probably, say, about 2030 or possibly after that for prospect of they get back into power. Boris Johnson's it's very popular at the moment with above 50% approval rating. It's just had a child, so people love that. He has a strong majority. After the virus is gone, he's probably going to push through proposals at will. This will probably generate support for him, being seen as a strong leader. As well, like Keir Starmer will have to look inwards into the party to try and fix it. So he's not looking outwards, trying to tackle the Conservatives. So the next election, I would not expect the Labour Party to win.
Do you have a favourite political text or author?
I probably have to go with Niccolo Machiavelli, just for how evil it was. It was just a parody of how politicians were just so evil and scheming and lying. That was just great.
And do you see yourself possibly joining the libertarian movement in the future?
No. I'm very big on the idea of government.
Why is that?
I think it's mainly comes down to things like the welfare system being established by the Beveridge report. And a lot of good that the government can do by giving some benefits to the citizen of the society, like giving free education, free healthcare.
Oh, but it's not really free though, is it? Because it's just taxpayers' money.
Yeah, you pay for your national insurance, but it's a lot cheaper than compared to states like America where you have to pay up front or be relying on a insurance company.
This could go on, so I think we've got to the target there with that.
In a libertarian kind of view, what would the ideal government be?
Well, it would be stripped back to its essential purposes, that is to defend the citizen, obviously to foster good international relations, but not really to be a handout. Not really to provide massive welfare payments or anything like that, or anything that would sort of interfere with natural market mechanisms. And that's it for this episode. All right, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully we can have a major debate about some of the things that we disagree on.
Yes, that would be
at a later date.
I feel like Fox News and start yelling at each other.
This has got more class than Fox News. Other than that, I hope to join you next time with more interviews on the Libertarian Listener. Thanks for listening.